believe that dismissing people, dismissing their concerns, or worse yet, shutting down media, shutting down elections, or shutting people out of the political process protects nothing. In fact, it is the most surefire way to destroy democracy. And speaking up and expressing opinions isn't election interference. Even when people express views outside your own country, and even when those people are very influential. And trust me, I say this with all humor, if American democracy can survive 10 years of Greta Thunberg scolding, you guys can survive a few months of Elon Musk. But what no democracy, American, German, or European, will survive is telling millions of voters that their thoughts and concerns, their aspirations, their pleas for relief are invalid or unworthy of even being.
I love that. I love that America is starting to lead when it comes to freedom again, and it saddens me a great deal what's happening in Europe and what happened in this country. Let's not just point fingers across the pond under the Biden administration. Joining me now to discuss the censorship, the communist love of it, and so many other things is Ben Weingarten, editor-at-large of Real Clear Investigations. Ben, communists are selling something evil and horrible. They always have been, and so they've always believed in controlling what people can see and hear. It's just that simple, because you can't sell a demonic religion of destruction if you're being honest about it.
Absolutely right. And to your point, that's why the communists generally go after religions first, because as an anti-religion, they don't want to have to compete against a religion that actually puts in place a system where man isn't God and lording over slaves, but people are actually endowed with inalienable rights. They can think for themselves. They can pursue their interests, their passions, their ambitions as they see fit, and they can be sovereign. They can be kings in their own home. And to your point, at core, the censorship, what I would call the censorship industrial complex that has lorded over American speech and really global speech for the last decade or so, at the end, to your point, is all about power and control. If you can control the narrative, you can control populations. You can control and maintain a political monopoly and therefore monopolize power. Pure and simple, that's what censorship is about. And they will drum up all kinds of other justifications for it. We don't want dangerous speech, so-called, to proliferate, because that can lead people to go down bad paths, and it can threaten national security, it can threaten public health, et cetera. But these are all pretexts that in reality are used to silence dissenters from regime orthodoxy, whoever that regime is and whatever their orthodoxy is. And Vice President Vance there, even though it may have fallen on deaf ears, and I love that you have the Europeans not laughing at the joke about Greta Thunberg, but he's raising a very serious and basic and fundamental point, which is that governments are responsible to their people. And if not, they're basically acting as masters and we are the slaves, as opposed to them actually governing with our consent and being responsive to our concerns. And if you're going to silence the other half of a country, if you're going to not permit dissent, you're not being responsive to your people, and you're not a government, you're a tyranny. And thank God, what a change in administration from one that not only supported a censorship industrial complex here, but supported its growth abroad as well. And now we have an administration that defends that liberty, that natural right at home, and is also going to defend our liberties abroad as well. And we're going to work together with allies and partners who actually share those values and principles, as opposed to privileging those who talk about democracy while they impose policies that are anything but, including when it comes to speech.
Yeah, and it's funny you brought up about the safety thing. I remember like it was yesterday, Jen Psaki and all of them talking about how they had to go to Facebook. Well, here she was about COVID.
In terms of actions, Alex, that we have taken, or we're working to take, I should say, from the federal government, we've increased disinformation research and tracking within the Surgeon General's office. We're flagging problematic posts for Facebook that spread disinformation.
It blew me away. I remember watching things like that, Ben. I'm sure it had the same effect on me that it did on you. And my jaw would just drop. It's not just that they were doing it. They were bragging that they were doing it. Of course, it's always for your safety. Always, always, always. Stalin said the exact same stuff. Mao said the same stuff. It's always for your safety, of course. But here in the United States of America, the land of the free, they felt totally comfortable standing up in front of the American people and let them know that the White House was flagging problematic posts. I'm floored at what's happened to this country.
A tyranny for your own good, of course.
Yeah,
And
of course.
you're right. They say it, and it's like so matter of fact. The approach, oh yeah, we're going to surveil social media en masse for ideas and opinions and even facts that we don't like. And then we're going to tell the big tech companies that we have the power to destroy with regulations and even by a statement from a president who says, by the way, you're killing people by what you allow to traffic on your platform. And we're going to tell them, you better take down this speech we don't like. But it's all for public health and fully in accordance with public health authorities, who of course didn't abuse those authorities and run roughshod over our rights and invent out of thin air things like 6 feet social distancing and made us wear 3 masks that didn't do a thing, and on, of course. But even if that weren't the justification for it, the fact that they could build that apparatus is the thing that's really terrifying. And I dove pretty deep in investigative reporting and testified a couple of times before Congress on what they actually did. But it is staggering what that administration built in the way of a censorship apparatus. And through that pretext of first public health and pandemic emergency measures, and then expanding it way beyond that, and really starting with the pretext of the Russians are interfering in our system, and so there's a real problem on social media, and we need to clamp down on foreign information operations and interference. Then we're going to take those powers and graft them onto Americans, because actually it doesn't really matter where the wrongthink is coming from. What matters is the content of the wrongthink. So we're not going to care that much about attribution. And basically you had a number of agencies within the federal government, including a sub-agency in Department of Homeland Security that no one ever heard of, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and they created essentially an outsourced censorship regime. Everyone has heard by this point about the Disinformation Governance Board that the Biden administration had to scrap because people called it out for the Orwellian, tyrannical engine that it would have been. But already a DGB, a Disinformation Governance Board, really existed, but they outsourced it to try and flout the law and the Constitution, and of course the First Amendment. You had CISA working with third-party, quote-unquote, NGOs, researchers, academic institutions, and they created a non-governmental so-called vehicle, at least in name, that would look to social media en masse, all of our tweets, all of our Facebook posts, for narratives that threatened election infrastructure. That is, if you had questions about the integrity of mass mail-in balloting, of all the other pandemic era, quote-unquote, emergency measures that were imposed to eviscerate and erode the integrity of the 2020 elections, they said that poses a threat to our critical election infrastructure. So your tweets basically questioning mail-in balloting and those ballot boxes all over the country, those were like potential mini terror attacks. And CISA worked with third parties to lobby the social media companies to change their content moderation policies, so-called, really, their censorship strategies, to make sure that anything challenging election integrity from their perspective would be potentially flagged and categorized as wrongthink and liable to be censored, violating their terms of service. And these outsourced entities, and I'm thinking primarily of the Election Integrity Partnership here, went about flagging tweets, Facebook posts, and other content violating the very social media content moderation policies they lobbied the social media companies to create and got Americans censored. Some of that content was flagged by the government. And of course, this vehicle was created by the government to avoid the First Amendment issues by creating another entity to do it. and you had multiple federal courts agree this was censorship by proxy. This was maybe the greatest attack on the First Amendment in American history at the scale of social media. And sadly, and in some ways, this brings us to today, where we see this kind of crisis playing out in other realms. The Supreme Court refused to rule on the merits of that case. They said the plaintiffs lacked standing, and they kicked it back to the lower courts. So we didn't get the Supreme Court to step in and say, what happened here was censorship by proxy. You had government pushing all these social media companies to censor. It created vehicles on the outside to push them to censor. Things that the government wanted flagged got censored. They abridged our speech. They tried to abridge our speech. There was a conspiracy to do it by proxy from these third parties, if not directly by what the government was saying in direct emails and phone conversations and publicly to the social media companies. Supreme Court would not step in and do its duty to rule on the merits and to curtail and prohibit that behavior. So now it's incumbent upon a president and a Congress to do it. The executive branch has started that work. It started it within hours of the president's inauguration with an executive order. And now it's time for Congress to do its job beyond the oversight it did, which was important over the last 4 years, to expose the size, scope, and nature of this complex of government agencies and NGOs and academic entities and beyond that work to silence us directly and by proxy.
Ben, these people, obviously they're a bunch of nutballs, and I don't like to, we don't man worship here anybody on the show, but Elon Musk purchasing Twitter, which of course he renamed X, which is kind of weird, but anyway, he renamed it X. It sounds small if you're not somebody aware of how powerful social media has become, but he really is the mortal enemy of all these evil monsters, isn't the fact that he took one of the biggest companies and freed it up, for lack of a better way to put it. They had everything, and the fact that he took one thing, it really hurt them, didn't it?
It really hurt them, and it also has now caused the other social media companies to, at least in their rhetoric, if not in their policies, have to change and go back towards something more closely resembling free speech, even though they're still by no means there, if for no other reason than the competitive pressure that X brought to it. But I think to your point, we ought to have thought of social media companies pre the second Trump administration as essentially controlled assets of the national security and intelligence apparatus. We would have liked to think of them as, this is the digital public square. This is the printing press. This is newspapers. This is the public square in 21st century America. But in reality, while they may have started out that way, governments, including our own, realized that if you could harness this power, first of all, these are tools of mass surveillance and intelligence, because you can develop a massive profile on people if you know what they're saying and who they're communicating with, at what times and where, and what the impact is. But also that you can manipulate public opinion if you can control what is allowed to be propagated on the social media platforms and what isn't seen, what's banned and what's shadow banned, what doesn't get the circulation that it otherwise would. So in the hands of good and benevolent people, these platforms can be great tools. And in the hands of those who want to exploit them, sometimes maybe in pursuit of beneficial things, but other times eviscerating our rights here at home, you can see the danger in it. And he took essentially what I would argue is a national security or intelligence asset out of the hands of those services, because it was the national security and intelligence apparatus that was pressuring and colluding with the likes of X and the executives at the other companies to ensure that the narrative they wanted was out there and things they didn't want, like the Hunter Biden laptop story, weren't out there. And he took it and he put up $40+ billion to say, I'm going to free the bird, as he put it. That was a courageous move in terms of the principle of let's defend free speech. It's courageous because he might have lit billions of dollars on fire. And maybe it was most courageous of all because as a consequence of it, all of these other governments that wanted to have control over the social media companies now feared that there was an asset that was not in their hands. He disarmed them. He took it out of their hands. And of course, there was a massive onslaught against Musk as a consequence of it. And that onslaught continues, and it only intensified, of course, when he backed Trump. But you had the Biden administration, any number of agencies investigating him after. You had the European governments who hate his guts. They have their own regulatory regime that threatens to impose crippling fines on the likes of X and other social media companies if they don't censor content the way that those European governments want. And of course, most of the European nations have nothing remotely resembling the First Amendment that governs their regulatory regime. So this was a courageous move, a costly move in defense of free speech. And thank God he did it. It's still not a perfect social media platform by any means. But when we look back in history, and really if you look at the ability to have anything resembling a republic, of course, it depends first on the ability to be able to debate, to share information, ideas, to argue, and may the best argument win. And you can make the case that if he didn't buy X and if he didn't take all these slings and arrows, and by the way, if he weren't so important to the US government as well, because of all the technologies he develops that have sort of made him a protected man in some ways, despite all the slings and arrows against him, this could be the difference between freedom and tyranny in this country when we look back on it over the long run.
Ben, something I was thinking about, actually I was thinking about it this morning. I was thinking about COVID and all the evil, horrible lockdown crap all the demons in this country did. And then I thought about where all those people are now. And this can expand way beyond COVID. We're obviously talking about censorship here. All the evil things that were done to the American people over the last 4 or 5, 6 years, 10 years, pick your number, it doesn't matter. The people who did it are not in prison. Most of them are not, resigning, retired, fired, in disgrace, had to change their name and move into the Rocky Mountains somewhere. These people are still among us, and many of them still have a bunch of power and the desire to do what they did again. How do we stop that?
Yeah, and to your point, they even took preemptive steps like pardoning the likes of Anthony Fauci and others to try and protect themselves. What we have right now is the beginnings of it, which is, first of all, you have all of these people who were targeted by the censorship apparatus, by the public health establishment and others, and they have actually assumed the very seats with the very authorities that were used to try and destroy them before. So I'm thinking of course, RFK Jr., of course, Donald Trump himself, Jay Bhattacharya at NIH, and others as well. Bhattacharya, by the way, was one of the plaintiffs in that case that went to the Supreme Court I mentioned before, and one of the leaders of the Great Barrington Declaration, which called for essentially liberty in response to the COVID response. But he was one of the plaintiffs in that case, Missouri v. Biden. So you have people who were targeted by the regime and by the system who are now in places of power. And that's a start. There's some level of justice in that. The Trump administration goes further in the way of policy. And a big part of how these people have accrued their powers is, first of all, obviously, when they're in government. But second of all, on the outside, when they're in this gulag archipelago of NGOs and think tanks, et cetera, and academic institutions. And the Trump administration put forth that first day executive order, which essentially says, no federal personnel can engage in this sort of censorship directly or by proxy behavior. And also, no federal resources can go towards it. And that, of course, means money. And money, government money, is part of the lifeblood of all of these outside organizations. Imperative to them. It helped birth this whole burgeoning censorship ecosystem on the outside. So depriving it of government employees, depriving it of government policies, and depriving it of federal government money is hugely significant and shouldn't be understated, as is the oversight work, because no one wants to be named and shamed and exposed. And if you could put a face and a resume and a record with the kind of tyrannical activity that we saw, no one wants that. So all of those things matter. The executive action and the oversight work matters. The next thing has to be codifying this in the law. And there's evidence that this Congress is going to try to do it. Let's see what happens. It's obviously, we've been burned before expecting there to be robust legislative action. And there are some who you would think be on our side who aren't on this issue. You have to have legislative action to codify it so that you can turn the president's executive action into law that's on the books and that can outlast any one president. Now, I would step back and say it's absurd on its face that you need laws to codify what the First Amendment already says. But these people have so perverted our system and have such a warped perspective on what their powers ought to be. And they think they know best for the American people. And so consequently, I think you need laws, and not only laws that codify what the administration is doing. And the administration is also, by the way, going to go back and do a review of everything the Biden administration did. And maybe there'll be some law enforcement action at the end of all that. But beyond that, I think there needs to be real teeth to the laws. And that means you have to have criminal penalties. It can't just be you get fired, maybe you lose your pension if you engage in this sort of conduct. There have to be criminal penalties, and then the law has to be enforced. Because if not, there is no deterrent action. And to your point, few have paid any real price except maybe being out of power. And so far, maybe their budgets have been cut, their prestige has been lost, they've been exposed publicly, and half the country may find them to be contemptible. Until and unless there is real teeth, there's going to be nothing to deter that sort of action. And basically, you're going to have tyrants in waiting, ready to spring when there's a new administration, a new Congress, et cetera. So it has to be done by law, executive action, and then ultimately you got to change the culture, and that's the really hard part. You have to have a country that produces people who don't view the world the way these people view the world and think they're smarter than everyone else, they're morally superior to everyone else, and so they not only have a right, but an obligation to lord over us. And that's a generational project. And that's a project that we all have to engage in our own lives, starting with our families, our friends, and in our communities.
Yeah, that's the long term. I totally agree. That's the ultimate solution. And I'm glad you brought up people going to prison, because everyone just thinks I'm an unhinged barbarian when I say we can't save the country without government people going to prison. And yes, I hate the government and I can't stand these people, but that's not why I say it. Unless government people go to prison, they're just going to do all the same stuff again because they know they can. There's no consequences. Kevin Kleinsmith getting 12 months probation for using his job at the FBI to lie on a freaking warrant application. He should be buried under the federal jail somewhere. The guy should never breathe free air again, but these people are never held to account.
And to your point, who was the presiding judge in the Kleinsmith case? I believe it was Judge James Boasberg.
It was. It was. Same freaking guy. Ben, my brother, thank you. Come back soon. I appreciate you. All right. I would thank you for coming to my YouTube channel, but I know how brilliant it is, and I know you love it here. So subscribe and watch. We're going to start really ramping things up and putting some funny stuff, some interesting stuff out there, some collaborations. Either way, my YouTube channel is officially the place to be. So stick around.